Back in the early 1890s, efforts were being made in the United States and Europe to find a way to record moving pictures on film. The most important work being done in the US was at Thomas Edison's newly built lab in Orange, New Jersey. Edison employee William Dickson was the head on this project. Dickson went on to develop this machine, the Kinetograph. In this drawing from Edison's patent, you can see the film wound onto reels, a feed reel at top holding the unexposed film, and a take-up reel at bottom to receive the film after it's passed in front of the shutter and been exposed. An electric motor powers the device, turning the reel and pulling the film past the shutter. Edison's Kinetograph worked, but it had a flaw. The film ran in a straight line from the feed reel, past the shutter, to the take-up reel. This meant that every time the motor jerked the film forward past the shutter, it was yanking on the whole feed reel. This was very hard on delicate celluloid film, getting rapidly yanked and stopped many times every second through a metal mechanism. This flaw meant that only a small amount of film could be used in the Kinetograph camera. Otherwise, the feed reel would be too heavy, like a dragging anchor, and the film, already under a lot of tension, would tear as it was jerked past the shutter. The earliest films Edison presented to the public were therefore not much more than 20 seconds long. Edison didn't use a movie projector to present these short films to the public. The projector hadn't been invented yet. Edison employee William Dickson instead came up with a personal viewing device called the kinetoscope. Inside the cabinet, the film was wound around 18 spools to form a loop, and it moved in a continuous rather than the start-stop motion of the Kinetograph camera. A disc shutter rotating in synchronization with the movement of the film froze each frame for an instant for the viewer's eye to create the impression of movement. This was the technology that existed for moving pictures when an American engineer named Enoch Rector returned to the United States in 1894 after working in South America for several years building railroads. He was strolling about the streets of New York City with his friends, the brothers Gray and Otway Latham, when they stumbled on the first storefront shop displaying Edison's new wonder, the kinetoscope. They went in to check it out and were impressed. As they left, Gray Latham had an idea. Why not use the kinetoscope to show prize fights? Prize fighting was illegal in most parts of the country, but there were no laws against showing films of prize fights. They could film a fight and show one round per kinetoscope machine and charge people a bundle to see them. It would be a sure way to get rich. The trio went down to Edison's New Jersey lab to explore the feasibility of their idea. They learned that the Kinetograph camera, if pushed to the limit, could handle about 1 minute's worth of film. This was not enough to record a real fight, which consisted of 3-minute rounds, but it would just barely do for a staged fight, a scaled-down fight of 1-minute rounds. So Rector and the Lathams went ahead and formed a company to make fight films. They called it the Kinetoscope Exhibiting Company. The first fight they filmed, here in the Black Maria movie studio at Edison's lab, was between lightweight contender Mike Leonard and a local unknown named Jack Cushing. The two men fought for 6 furious rounds, a long break between each round to allow William Dickson and his assistants time to push the camera into a darkroom to change the film. Cushing, coached from off-camera, went down on cue at the end of the 6th round. With the film in the can, Enoch Rector went to work on the kinetoscope machine, tripling its capacity so it could hold a full minute of film. These 6-foot-long super kinetoscopes were used to show the Leonard Cushing fight when it went on exhibition. For its second production, the Kinetoscope Exhibiting Company filmed a similarly staged fight between heavyweight champion Gentleman Jim Corbett and a local bruiser named Peter Courtney. The 6 rounds of what would be called Corbett versus Courtney became the biggest hit of the kinetoscope era. It was now 1895, and the Kinetoscope Exhibiting Company still hadn't achieved its original goal of filming a real fight. The partnership broke up at this point, and Enoch Rector and the Latham brothers went their separate ways. The Lathams, joining with their father Woodville, set out to develop a machine for projecting film onto a screen, which they were convinced was the future. Rector stayed with the existing technology of kinetograph camera and kinetoscope viewer. He set out to adapt them to film and exhibit real prize fights. The problem that Rector faced was that the film in the Edison camera, running straight from feed reel to take-up reel, was under a lot of tension. He had to figure out how to eliminate this tension if he were to use bigger reels of film, enough film to record the 3-minute rounds of a fight. Otherwise, the film would break. His solution was simple. Disconnect the film reels from the electric motor and turn them by hand. With 2 assistants manually turning the reels, he could ensure that the film was always kept slack and tension-free, no matter how big the reels. There was just one hitch. To turn the reels by hand, your eye constantly on the film to make sure there was no tension, you had to be inside the camera. Rector and his assistants had to do their filming from inside the camera. What Rector did was he built a giant camera, big enough to accommodate the camera mechanism and a team of men to work it. From the outside, it looked like a crude wooden shack. Inside, it was carefully sealed to keep out stray light. It was outfitted with windows so the men inside could see what they were doing. The windows were tinted red so the film wouldn't be affected. Movie film back then, remember, was orthochromatic. It wasn't sensitive to red light. Rector's shack-light camera was essentially a photography darkroom. He called it the Kaneto multiscope. You can see in this picture that it has 2 lens openings, each with a window beside it. There were in fact 2 camera mechanisms sealed inside, each operated by a 3-man crew. Rector's idea was to make a duplicate record of a fight so that he'd still be covered if one of the machines broke down. The first real prize fight Rector attempted to film with the Kaneto multiscope was a heavyweight battle between Bob Fitzsimmons and Peter Mayer in February 1896. It was held on a sandbar in the Rio Grande River on the Texas-Mexico border in order to avoid the law, because prize fighting was illegal in Texas. Rector's plan was to film the fight in its entirety, then select the best footage from the 2 cameras and show it to the public on a gigantic new kinetoscope that he was going to build, a 15-foot-long monster, large enough to hold a loop of 3 minutes of film. In order to make such a massive and expensive device financially viable, he planned to outfit it with multiple viewing ports so that 5 customers could watch at the same time. Rector's venture in Texas failed. The day was too overcast and dark for filming on the insensitive film stock he had, and he had trouble with the batteries powering the shutter mechanisms in his Kaneto multiscope. The fight itself was also a bust, Fitzsimmons knocking out Mayer in just 95 seconds. Rector subsequently managed to film a Mexican bullfight with his big machine, but beyond that, he returned to New York empty-handed. Rector went back to the drawing board after that, and he did something that would have shocked Thomas Edison. He did away with electricity altogether. All the wiring, the batteries, the complexity that could so easily fail in the field, he got rid of it all. The new camera Rector built, called the Veriscope, was operated entirely by hand. 2 men would manually turn the film reels, while a third man manually cranked the film past the shutter. Here's what it looked like, set up at ringside to film the heavyweight championship battle between Jim Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons on March 17, 1897. Note that there are now 3 lens openings and 3 corresponding red-tinted windows. To ensure that he didn't miss a second of action through mechanical mishap, Rector outfitted his Veriscope with 3 camera mechanisms, each with its own 3-man crew. They would work in sequence, camera 1 starting, then camera 2 after 4 minutes, then camera 3 after another 4 minutes, then back to camera 1, and so on, as long as it took. Each camera was loaded with 1,200 feet of film, good for 8 minutes. So at any given time, there would be 2 cameras filming the fight, while the film was being changed on the third machine. They would use extra wide film, 63 millimeters, as opposed to Edison's standard 35 millimeters. It would also have a surprisingly modern, wide-frame format. Rector did this so he could set up his Veriscope close to the action and still encompass the ring. Rector started filming as soon as the contender, Bob Fitzsimmons, stepped into the ring, and he continued right through to when Fitzsimmons knocked out champion Jim Corbett in the 14th round, and on into the post-fight mayhem when the ring filled with people. Rector successfully recorded about an hour and 15 minutes of uninterrupted action with his hand-operated Veriscope machine. It was a total success. The resulting film, known as the Corbett-Fitzsimmons Fight, premiered in New York City on May 22, 1897. Rector by this time had abandoned his idea of the 5-person kinetoscope and exhibited it using a projector he built. Like his Veriscope camera, he used assistants to manually turn the big, heavy reels to keep tension off the film. It might seem primitive today, but it worked. The Corbett-Fitzsimmons Fight became a huge hit, a startlingly clear feature-length presentation in an era when films were small and grainy and lasted just a few minutes. Several more fights were filmed using Enoch Rector-style devices, giant cameras manually operated by men working inside them. Soon, however, the technology faded away, replaced by a simple loop, an extra gear placed in front of the shutter to keep a loop of slack in the film. It had been invented by a Frenchman named Eugene Laust, employed by Rector's former partners, the Lathams, and would become standard in movie cameras and projectors going into the 20th century. Laust got nothing for it beyond the worthless shares he received in the Latham's company, which went bankrupt. Woodville Latham held the patent for it, but he died broke just the same. As for Enoch Rector, he owned a 25% share in the net profits of the Corbett-Fitzsimmons Fight film, which went on to gross an estimated $700,000 and become the cinema's first big hit. When he returned to New York after taking the film on a world tour, however, his business partner informed him that there were no net profits, that everything, the equivalent of $12 million today, had been spent. Rector thus became the first victim of what would come to be known as Hollywood accounting.